Willkommen zurück im Programm.
Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to the program on the first day of our conference. I'm happy to introduce Franziska Bollerey. She's a professor for architecture and the history of urbanism at the University of Delft. And until recently, she was the chairwoman of the scientific board of the Bauhaus Dessau until she resigned at her own wish. She wrote a book a number of years ago, and we loved it when we studied. It's about utopian socialism and architecture. It's about the social possibilities of architecture. And we are very happy to have her here for a presentation, and we are very happy that she contributed to Das wachsende Haus, the first book in our series, and we are happy that we could use the original book for this Martin Wagner book. And she has produced two projects for the exhibition, a slideshow a training course concerning learning how to live, learning how to house is one of them. And she will now give a presentation about the gloom and the glory of the Berlin multi-residential building. A very warm welcome to Franziska Bollerey.
With great interest, I listened to the American analyses. I saw the people from Coty and Co. And of course, resistance and critique must be a property of civil society, and each fragmentation of the individual, as it seems to me, is a sign for a bad democracy. Jesko has just said I'm going to introduce you to the history of a city where at the beginning of the 20th century, 80 to 90% of the population used to live. It was the city of Berlin. I tried to break down my presentation into 5 parts. The city of Berlin, which became a city of Mietskaserne tenements, and then I'm going to focus on James Hobrecht, who developed the foundations for this city with its Mietskaserne. I'm going to show the inner courtyards and the firewalls and intrinsic property of the Mietskaserne. I'm going to elaborate on the Congrès CIAM, the Congrès International de l'Architecture, who criticized the Mietskaserne, and I'm going to conclude by explaining the rediscovery of the Mietskaserne. Now let me start with Berlin on the move. It shows, this picture, how Berlin looked like. It's a drawing by Martin Wagner, who at the time was city councillor for construction of Berlin, which belonged to the Weimar Republic. Berlin was in contact at the time with other European metropolises. Sorry, it wasn't me. Could we go back to my presentation?
Naja, Sie haben das Bild von Berlin.
Well, at any rate, you saw the image of Berlin and Paris and the Eiffel Tower. The networking of Berlin as a metropolis had also something to do with new transportation opportunities. Berlin here is shown as the center of Europe, with flights going out to all other metropolises of Europe. In the middle, you see the small nucleus of a town that was for the first time mentioned in official documents in 1237. And now you see on the right-hand side the outline of Berlin. And this is precisely the city that emerged in the 1920s. There you see the inner core stretching from Cologne and Berlin, the dual towns, and around that you see Wedding, Friedrichshain, Prenzlauer Berg, and the orange part is Kreuzberg, the classical districts, residential areas with the Mietskaserne, mass tenements. In the middle of the 19th century, Berlin becomes the most important industrial location of Germany after the Ruhr area. And so, since Berlin grew, it was necessary to develop an urban plan. There was an architect called Peter Joseph Lenné. He developed Luisenstadt, or planned for Luisenstadt. Here you see the axis of what today is Kreuzberg with Oranienplatz, Moritzplatz, Bethanien. For every metropolis in the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, it was necessary to have a well-developed transportation system. Here you see the Berlin railway stations with an aerial view of Potsdamer Square. It's one of the central Berlin parks that you see here, the Gleisdreieck Park, because the railway line is no longer used, although you still see where it crossed this area. And to the south and north, you see the Berlin, typical Berlin, Mietskaserne. In the 1920s, when people talked about Berlin as a flourishing city, Berlin of the golden age of the 20s, there's a reason why people talked about the golden age. And I picked out two examples. These are maps pertaining to the end of the 19th century. Berlin was a bicycle city. At the time, they already had bicycle lanes, and there were clear indications where you were allowed and not allowed to ride a bike. And on the left-hand side, you see part of the districts Friedrichshain and Kreuzberg. And the black dots you can see are the movie theaters that were existent in those Berlin districts in 1910. Now I'd like to move on to Jeeves Hobrecht, who was a civil engineer, and I'm going to show his plan. We had already talked about this first city extension under the architect Lenné. There you see again the core city with Friedrichstraat to the north and south and Kreuzberg, and around this core urban infrastructure needed to be redeveloped. In 1858, Hobrecht started dealing with the sewage system in Berlin. He was in favor of smaller housing units. After his plan had been adopted in 1862, large blocks were created. Hobrecht wanted to have many squares. As you can see on the left-hand side, all of these squares were later on neglected and were never built. Now here you can imagine how the city developed in a formerly agricultural area. So in a short time span of just 50 years or so, the city of Berlin expanded, and the Mietskaserne, the mass tenements, is expanded as well. This example comes from Wedding and Kreuzberg in 1866 to 1889, and the last picture on the right-hand side is 1912. So there is more and more high-density construction. The red units you see are commercial units, and the blue areas are residential units, the Mietskaserne. Just to give you an idea how such a Mietskaserne looked like, not only on plans and city maps. Here you see a few photographs. Wherever there were small buildings, bigger units were built in the same place. So you see this displacement project, and it's not only a process that took place in Berlin. You see also other cities on the left, Istanbul in the middle, Vienna, and to the right, London. This is a displacement, a replacement of the original buildings, which is a characteristic process of the densification of living in cities. As I told you, 80 to 90% of the working class in Berlin used to live in those Mietskaserne. It was typical for the lifestyle of the working class. But I also would like to show you how in other metropolises people lived. There you see a cartoon by Lord Cushing, London going out of town. The march of brick and mortar. And this was the typical cottage built as a house for the working class. So here, of course, living in those mass tenements, there were many problems. And the hygiene situation was poor, as you're going to see in the exhibition when you look at my presentation there. Of course, the occupancy rate in a house or on a plot of land in London was lower compared to Berlin. Since in London you had cottages and in Berlin you had these Mietskaserne, these tenements, as you can see, in London, there were 8 people to a house, and in Berlin, there were 76 people in a house. Now, comparing to living in Paris, you would see the following situation. In Paris, like in the Mietskaserne, you also have a vertical stratification of society in the house. The poor people, who had the poorest living conditions regarding heat in summer and cold in the winter, were living on the top floors. In Berlin, they also lived in the basements. So there you see how it looked like when you had to live near to the rooftop or in the basement. Houses were more comfortable on the first and second and maybe third floor. As a consequence of such housing situations, people were of poor health. And you see on the right-hand side, the number of coffins is highest in the attic and in the basement, which means the mortality was higher there. We have seen the luxury apartments in New York using most expensive material as building material. And of course, in a big city, you would see the starkest contrast regarding the size of an apartment and its equipment. This is an example from Vienna, living at the ring road and living as a worker in another district. And you could see that the apartment of a worker was just as big as the bathroom of a bourgeois family. Let's come back to Berlin and the Mietskaserne. This is an example of a Mietskaserne block in Wedding, in Swinemünderstraße. And there you see again what I've shown you about Kreuzberg already, the building between 1866 and beginning of the 20th century. Usually building starts at the corners, and the most dense or high-density construction takes place after 1890 and up to 1900. The Berlin Mietskaserne is interesting for many photographers. It's an object of aesthetic considerations. And I followed this tendency myself, and I took photographs for some time of Mietskaserne tenements. What is well known about those tenements, those Mietskaserne, are the inner yards and the firewalls. Sometimes there were even up to 6 inner courtyards. And in between each of the courtyards, there is a kind of gate. There you see an example from Vienna and Berlin. On the left-hand side, the example shows a Mietskaserne which had 275 individual apartments with 2,100 people living there under very miserable conditions. Here you see photographs. Photographers went to Meyershof because it was a very popular object, and people rose against the lack of hygiene. People protested against the lack of hygiene in those inner courtyards. Again, you see here Mayersche Höfe, which is Berlin, Budapest, and Berlin near Görlitzer Bahnhof, and again another courtyard from Budapest. In Vienna, in Budapest, everywhere you had this densification process due to the erection of Mietskaserne. What was typical for Budapest and the dwelling of workers was this kind of gallery apartments, as you can see on the left-hand side. And we have seen that in Prenzlauer Berg in Berlin, and it was also, of course, a situation where formerly workers used to live. You now have a gentrification, the galleries are being preserved, and the apartments are turned into higher value luxury apartments. In the 1920s, of course, people started to protest and said they want to have a different house to live in. They want more sun, more light, more air. There you see a number of examples from Berlin. Just to show that an inner courtyard can be an attractive motive for a photographer. Social and hygiene conditions were poor, but I'm not going to focus on that very much. I also would like to mention that in the beginning of the 1930s, there also was a lot of political struggle exemplified in the inner courtyards. There were people who lived in the same courtyard who supported the Nazis or who supported the socialists or communists. What's interesting to note is that people protested, demonstrated for lower rents, and the deprivation of the working class at the time was really evident. When you look at this inscription on the wall, first we need to eat, then we can pay the rent. Of course, at the time already there was a struggle to have the rents lowered, but the overall situation of the workers was poor anyway, and there was a lot of suffering and economic hardship. Now, I already mentioned the 1920s, and I already mentioned the International Architectural Congress. There was a group of architects who condemned the Mietskaserne. There was a specific congress, the fourth congress, about Mietskaserne, about these tenements in Berlin. Ever since the beginning of the 20th century, more and more people say that living conditions are intolerable. There were left-wing politicians and physicians who insisted that such a city is not worthwhile living is. This culminates in a book written by Werner Hegemann, Berlin Carved in Stone. This Berlin was not completely destroyed in the Second World War. A lot of the housing stock remained intact. The pictures I'm showing here show the devastation of the city center of Berlin, but on the periphery, and when you look at the chronology of the city, you have to show the devastation of the city center, but very close to that, you have Tiergarten, you have parks, and this park that we are located in at the moment was used in order to plant vegetables to make sure that there is at least a partial supply of food. In this post-war situation, West Berlin invites the architects of the world in 1957 to organize the Interbau exhibition. I still have one more picture of the destroyed city. This destroyed city was the basis for the question of how can a rebuilt Berlin look like. I've specifically selected those aerial photographs of destroyed Berlin. On the left-hand side, you see a carpet that is now displayed in the atrium of the Ministry of Defense. I think that's very progressive, but whenever I want to show people this carpet in the Ministry of Defense, showing the destroyed city of Berlin, showing the effects of the war, I hardly ever get the opportunity to get inside the ministry and inside the courtyard to show people this carpet. Well, we were talking about Interbau in 1955, where the most important architects of the world, Corbusier, Niemeyer, Gropius, come to Berlin to think about what can be built instead of the Mietskaserne, how to sort of fulfill the promise of air and light for people who live in these houses that formerly used to be Mietskaserne. The ideology of the less densely built city, the critique of the Mietskaserne, led to the situation where many of the old quarters were demolished, especially in the district of Wedding. people get displaced and they get resettled to the satellite towns like Märkisches or Gropiusstadt. But early on, even in the middle of the 60s, there is also a resistance regarding the demolition of the old Mietskaserne. In 1968, the Technical University of Berlin organizes a congress which is called Diagnose 68. At the height of the students' movement, and students of architecture participate in that congress and protest against speculation, against the demolition, and they have this congress as a sign of protest. In 1972, and I can just show some of the manifold activities that took place at the time and made sure that the Mietskaserne is seen as a valuable house again. One activity, reappraising, reevaluating the Mietskaserne, was an atlas that charted the Mietskaserne situation and highlighted the urban qualities of the Mietskaserne and the quality of such districts and blocks. Another activity was a series of postcards published by Dieter Kramer, a photographer. Gerd Spangenberg, an architect, joined him in this publication. At the time, Spangenberg was married to Judith Spangenburg, and they ran a wonderful bookshop focusing on design, architecture, and photography. This bookshop still exists, and there the series of photographs was published. And as a result, people looked at the Mietskaserne again and re-evaluated the qualities. This is one of these postcards. I should have quoted Wim Wenders in the beginning when I started showing photographs of the inner courtyards and the firewalls. As far as the firewalls are concerned, Wim Wenders said they exist only in Berlin. I showed him that they do exist also in Budapest and in other cities that use the same type of tenement. But let me quote Wim Wenders from his book, The Act of Seeing. He said, the smooth area rejects imagination, and it was the non-smooth character of Mietskaserne that people started to get interested in. Especially artists were interested in the visual qualities. Of course, they were also interested in the low rents, and that is why so many creative people came and started to live in Kreuzberg. The smooth surface rejects imagination. This quotation of Wim Wenders shows how the creative sections of the people got more and more interested in the Mietskaserne. A culmination point in the recognition of Mietskaserne was reached in 1984 to 87 in the context of the International Building Exhibition. At the same time, in 1987, Berlin celebrated its 750th anniversary. It's a very young metropolis compared to Paris and London, who are over 2,000 years old. The International Building Exhibition of 1984 to 1987 was an event that, like in 1957, attracted architects from all over the world. They all came to West Berlin and developed projects there. There were two main directions. There was a building exhibition for old buildings and another one for new buildings. And since I called my presentation the up and down and up of the Mietskaserne, I'd like to focus on the International Building Exhibition for old buildings, existing buildings. And there was an interesting person, Hartwald Dahemer. He would have loved to meet the Coty & Co. people. He was the one who curated the exhibition for old buildings. And there, in the context of IHAAU, of the International Building Exhibition, the mix of functions takes center stage again. In the 20s, they used to say that living, working, and leisure time must be separated. And in Kreuzberg, you remember the development from 1966 to 1912. There was always a mix of living and working, because in many of these Mietskaserne, people used to live in those houses but have their workshops there as well. And the same thing happens when creative people move to Kreuzberg. They settle down in Kreuzberg and open up their ateliers in the places where they used to live. They had no separation between working and living. This was typical just for the satellite cities. So the reappraisal of Mietskaserne in the context of the 750th anniversary of Berlin was evident. Here you see on the right-hand side former East Berlin. There you see the newly refurbished Mietskaserne buildings. And very close by, buildings were dilapidated. Only certain streets were refurbished to be shown as model cases, as showcases. So until the 1990s, this was the typical situation in Prenzlauer Berg, which used to be East Berlin. And you could see these poorly refurbished Mietskaserne everywhere, with the exception of a few showcases to be shown to tourists and the like. 750th anniversary and the International Building Exhibition, the time period 1984 to 1987. Here we really see a recognition of the qualities not only of the Mietskaserne as such, but of the inner courtyards in particular. They were revitalized. They were extended by ways of removing some rear buildings or side buildings. At the time, there was a major squatting movement in Berlin. Many demonstrations took place, many skirmishes between squatters and the police. People even died in those fights. Walter Hemer had developed projects for squatters, where these squatters would be put in a position to work as painters or plumbers and work together with master builders to refurbish the houses they had occupied. This, by the way, is the photograph in the middle. So that was a progressive situation. Squatters were supported. Nowadays, we would be happy if we had such a support for squatters. Living in a Mietskaserne was not only something interesting for photographers, it was also interesting for painters. This is an Otto Nagel painting showing a Mietskaserne in one of the central districts. Not all of the squares that Hobrecht had dreamed of were built, but here in Otto Nagel's picture you see such a Mietskaserne near a square. And on the right-hand side you see the plan of the city to the left and the right of the Spree River. We've talked about gentrification several times already today, and the Mietskaserne is characterized by gentrification. The indigenous population gets crowded out, the houses are bought up. Luckily enough, tenants now have 10 years before their contract can be terminated. But in spite of that, the indigenous population gets crowded out, gets displaced, and the caravan of gentrification has stretched from Kreuzberg, Friedrichshain, Prenzlauer Berg, Neukölln. And I think the next place to be gentrified will be Lichtenberg. And if you want to speculate, if you want to invest, I would guess that Lichtenberg is the place to go. My last pictures show the historical Mietskaserne once more. Street life. And these pictures also show that the gentrified Mietskaserne city looks like that today. And this is a picture from Prenzlauer Berg, and this was my presentation. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Franziska, for giving us such a wonderful historical overview. I have one more question, and maybe there's also somebody from the audience who has a question. We still have a bit of time. You've shown vividly that the Mietskaserne are a typical urban form of construction, and it used to be a place that was inhumane and was built with high-density settlement purposes in order to get a profit. But nowadays it's rediscovered and becomes an object of gentrification. It's always one and the same house that has gone through many phases of history. So does that mean that architecture plays no role? It all depends on the times, or how come that the same architectural design can have such different values in a city? Houses, well, now you have to always make a distinction between the apartments in the front of the house and the apartments in the side and rear wings and the inner courtyards. The front house was always an object of speculation. And for the front house, it was not difficult to find tenants because the front houses were decorated. The new appraisal, the reappraisal, has something to do with that smooth facades are being rejected. What do I see in Märkische Viertel? Where's my imagination? How can I find an object for my imagination? I tried to quote Wim Wenders, the smooth surface deflects imagination. These old houses have more facets to focus your imagination on. Is there a question from the audience? I just wanted to ask. I'll be brief. Could you explain the term indigenous or autonomous population? I mean, what does it mean? Well, what I meant, of course, you cannot say indigenous people of these districts must have lived in Berlin for ages and ages. Of course, it's not an ethnically coined term. But what I meant to say is the traditional population of these districts is being displaced. Jesko just said that the Mietskaserne is a typology. and generations of different people lived in those places, and the Berlin population, well, of course, was always characterized by migration. Also in the 19th century, there were many migrants living in Berlin, so there's a transformation process that was shaped by many different inhabitants or residents of Berlin. In the framework of our exhibition, where we always had a concrete link with people trying to solve their housing question, at least we did that for the one-to-one models, and we said that would make sense, and it's a stable process if people plan their own house. And the Mietskaserne is an architectural typology that can be used by each and every one. Yes, the Mietskaserne is damn flexible. What can I do with an apartment in Märkische Viertel, in these prefab buildings? What do people in Coty & Co. want? They want to have more flexibility, and that's the good thing about this mix. I mean, if the people of Coty lived in such a Mietskaserne, if they lived in the front house and in the inner courtyard they had a canteen or whatever social meeting place, that's a good thing to have. In Amsterdam, for instance, more and more satellite towns are being built, and in the ground floors of these prefab buildings, they have set up rooms for artisans and small service industry, a laundry, or a seamstress can work. That they try to develop a mix of usage for the satellite city. I know that in Märkische Viertel, in one of our satellite towns, many empty apartments were used as guest houses for the tenants, or they could be used by the tenants if they had a party. So the housing company tries to increase the quality of living by giving such communal spaces. But the Mietskaserne offers all of that in its intrinsic structure. Thank you very much. Franziska, Bollerey.